The Phantom of the Opera House. The audience was frozen. Not a breath stirred, not a single eye blinked. The chandeliers ceased their flickering. The very air had stopped moving. And then from the shadows, the figure emerged. He no longer wore his evening attire, but a robe of black, flowing like liquid night. His face, once shrouded in shadow, was now visible. A hollow visage of bone and decay. His eyes two empty voids of endless darkness. "It is time," the figure intoned. Victor staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "No, no, this was not our bargain." "But it was," the figure murmured, stepping closer. "You promised that when the time came, you would play for me alone." Victor turned to flee, but his body would not obey. His limbs were rooted in place, his hands locked upon his violin. A force unseen lifted his bow, guiding it across the strings. And then he played. The melody that poured from his violin was unlike anything he had ever known. It was sorrow and despair, agony and longing, a dirge that wept for souls long lost. The very walls of the opera house trembled with its power, the chandeliers swaying as though caught in a storm. Yet there was no audience to hear it, no rapturous applause, no adoring gazes, only the phantom. He stood in the empty hall, his skeletal fingers raised like a conductor, his hollow eyes fixed upon Victor with a hunger that knew no end. The music did not stop. Victor played until his fingers bled, until his arms ached, until the very breath in his lungs grew thin. Yet still, the bow moved, compelled by an unseen force. As dawn broke over Blackmoor, the opera house stood silent once more. The patrons arrived for the morning rehearsal, only to find the theater empty, save for a single violin resting upon the stage. Its strings were worn thin, its body slick with crimson. Victor Moreau was never seen again. Yet on nights when the wind howls through the empty corridors of the Blackmoor Opera House, a single violin can be heard, playing a mournful tune, a melody of longing, a melody of despair, the ghostly symphony of a man who bargained with darkness and lost. The Phantom of the Opera House. The Grand Opera House of Blackmoor had once been the pride of the city, its towering facade a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, its vast stage a sanctuary for the finest musicians and performers of the age. But time had not been kind to it. The once gilded balconies were now tarnished, their elaborate carvings obscured beneath layers of dust. The great chandelier which had once bathed the hall in golden light hung in darkness, its crystals dulled by neglect. Despite its decline, the Blackmoor Opera House still stood, and within its walls, the echoes of forgotten melodies lingered like ghosts of a bygone era. It was within this decaying monument that Victor Moreau labored, a man of meager fortune, but boundless ambition. A violinist of considerable talent, he had come to Blackmoor in search of fame, yet fortune had eluded him. His fingers, though deft upon the strings, could not summon the success he so desperately craved. The world was indifferent to his genius, and with each passing day, his dreams crumbled further into dust. One fateful evening, as he sat alone in the empty concert hall, despair gnawing at his heart, a whisper drifted through the air, soft, elusive, yet unmistakably real. Victor Moreau. He turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. The hall was empty, yet the air was thick with an unseen presence. A chill ran through him, the flickering candlelight casting long, wavering shadows upon the walls. "You play beautifully," the voice murmured, "yet the world does not listen." Victor rose to his feet, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Who is there?" From the darkness beyond the stage, a figure emerged, a man clad in evening attire of a style long past. His coat was finely cut, his cravat of silk, his gloves pristine. Yet his face was shrouded in shadow, obscured as though the very light recoiled from him. Victor stepped back. You are a trick of the mind." "Am I?" The figure glided forward, his movements unnaturally smooth, as if he walked upon air itself. "I am but a humble patron of the arts, a lover of music, and I wish to offer you a gift." Victor's throat was dry. "What gift?" The stranger extended a gloved hand. "Fame, fortune, the adoration of all who hear your music." His voice was as smooth as velvet, each word laced with an unspoken promise. "I can make you the greatest musician the world has ever known." Victor hesitated, his mind warring with his desire. "And in return?" The stranger smiled. "A mere trifle. A promise that, when the time comes, you shall play for me alone." A bargain, simple in its terms. And yet, as Victor stared into the void where the man's eyes should have been, a terrible unease settled in his bones. Still, desperation is a cruel master, and ambition an unrelenting fire. With trembling fingers, he clasped the stranger's hand. The moment their hands met, a jolt of ice coursed through Victor's veins. The air around him grew heavy, thick with the scent of decay. The candle flames guttered and died, plunging the hall into darkness. Then, silence. When the lights flickered back to life, the stranger was gone. Victor stood alone upon the stage, the violin still clutched in his hands. Yet something had changed. He could feel it in the very marrow of his bones. That night, he played as he had never played before. His fingers danced across the strings, summoning melodies so hauntingly beautiful they seemed to weep with sorrow and ecstasy alike. The notes soared through the empty theater, filling the hollow space with a music that had never before been heard. And the world listened. The days that followed saw Victor's rise to greatness. Word of his extraordinary talent spread like wildfire. Patrons flocked to hear him perform, filling the once empty halls with their applause and admiration. Invitations arrived from the most esteemed concert halls across the continent. His name was spoken with reverence, his performances hailed as divine. Yet with each performance, a shadow lurked at the edges of his vision. In the reflection of the grand mirrors, he would glimpse a figure standing just beyond sight. In the hush between notes, he would hear a whisper echoing from the rafters. And in the final chord of each piece, he felt the chill of unseen eyes watching, waiting. Still, he ignored these omens. For what was a little unease compared to immortality? It was not until one fateful night that the price of his bargain was revealed in full. The Blackmore Opera House was alight with golden brilliance, every seat filled with nobles and patrons eager to hear Victor's latest composition. He stepped onto the stage, the violin resting against his shoulder, his fingers poised to play. But as the bow touched the strings, the hall fell silent, not with anticipation but with unnatural stillness. The Dollmaker's Apprentice. The narrow streets of Greywick twisted like veins through the heart of the city, lined with shops that stood in stubborn defiance of time. Among them, nestled between a cobbler's workshop and an apothecary, stood Harrow and Sons, makers of fine dolls and curiosities. It was a place of quiet wonder, where porcelain faces peered from darkened windows, their glass eyes reflecting the flickering glow of lanterns. Within its walls, Elias Harrow labored beneath the watchful gaze of his master, the esteemed doll maker Aldrich Harrow, who had crafted dolls so exquisite that they were rumored to possess souls. Each was sculpted with such delicate precision that they seemed to breathe, their painted lips forever poised to whisper secrets to those who dared listen. Elias had been taken in as an apprentice at the age of 13. His fingers quick, his mind sharp, his admiration for his master boundless. Years passed, and under Aldrich's tutelage, he honed his craft, sculpting delicate hands, painting lashes so fine they seemed to flutter in the candlelight. Yet there was one lesson his master had not yet taught him, the final secret of true lifelikeness. Aldrich spoke little of it, but Elias knew there was something more, something hidden beneath the surface of his master's genius. He had seen it in the dolls that Aldrich created alone, those that were locked away in the back room, never sold, never displayed. They were too perfect, their eyes too knowing, their expressions too filled with something akin to longing. Elias's curiosity festered. One evening, when Aldrich had retired early, he seized his chance. With careful steps, he crept to the forbidden room, his heart hammering as he turned the key in the lock. The door groaned open, revealing rows of dolls, each seated neatly upon wooden chairs, their dresses pressed, their curls arranged in immaculate ringlets. But these were no ordinary dolls. Their faces bore subtle imperfections, a freckle beneath the eye, a faint scar upon the brow, details no artist would think to include. Their hair was not the synthetic strands used for other dolls, but real, fine as silk. And their eyes, oh, their eyes, held something unnatural, something alive. A cold breath stirred the air behind him. "You should not be here, Elias." He turned sharply to see Aldrich standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Master, what are these dolls?" Elias stammered. Aldrich exhaled, stepping into the room. "The final step in our craft," he murmured. "The secret you have long sought." Elias swallowed hard. "Tell me." Aldrich studied him for a long moment. Then, as though he had resigned himself to some inevitable fate, he walked to a locked cabinet and retrieved a small, ornate box. He placed it upon the work table and lifted the lid, revealing a vial of dark liquid. "This," Aldrich said, "is the essence of life." Elias frowned. "Paint?" Aldrich chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "No, my boy. This is something far older. Something that binds the soul to the vessel. It is the final touch that breathes life into the lifeless." Elias felt a shiver run through him. "You mean the dolls?" Aldrich nodded. "They are not merely dolls, Elias. They are echoes of what once was. Their souls are borrowed, drawn into the form we create for them." A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken horrors. But Elias, ever ambitious, felt not fear, but fascination. "I wish to learn," he whispered. Aldrich's eyes darkened. "Once you take this knowledge, there is no turning back. Do you truly wish to bear this burden?" Elias nodded. And so, his final lesson began. For weeks, Elias labored with newfound purpose. He sculpted the finest doll he had ever created, ensuring every feature was flawless, every detail precise. Yet, despite his efforts, something was missing. The dolls Aldrich created had a presence, a soulfulness that his lacked. Then, one evening, an idea took root. What if he made a doll in his own image? Surely none could be more lifelike than a perfect reflection of himself. He set to work with feverish determination, carving the porcelain face to match his own, painting the same sharp green eyes, the same dark curls, the same slight scar upon his chin. When it was finished, he stared at it with a sense of triumph and unease. It was him. And now, it only needed one final touch. With trembling fingers, he uncorked the vial and brushed a single drop of the dark liquid onto the doll's lips. The room seemed to tighten around him, the air growing thick and suffocating. Then, the doll blinked. Elias stumbled back, his breath catching. The doll's lips parted, and from within its porcelain throat came a whisper, his own voice, distorted and hollow. "Thank you." Terror clutched at Elias's heart, but pride swelled within him. He had done it. He had created life. Yet, as the days passed, something strange began to occur. The doll did not sit idle like the others. When Elias entered his workshop each morning, he found it moved, its head tilted, its hands resting in a different position. At first, he dismissed it as the work of his own forgetfulness. But then he began to hear it, a rustling in the dead of night, a whisper just at the edge of hearing, a soft, lilting chuckle. One evening, as he extinguished his lantern, he caught movement in the dim light. The doll, seated upon the chair beside his work table, had shifted. Its head had turned towards him, its lips curled into the faintest of smiles, a perfect imitation of his own. Elias's breath grew shallow. "Did you move?" he whispered, the question absurd, yet necessary. The doll did not respond, but the next morning, when he awoke, he found it standing beside his bed. Its tiny porcelain hand rested upon his pillow. Its glass eyes stared into his own. Elias's scream tore through the house. Sleep eluded him after that. He locked the doll away, sealing it within a chest of iron. Yet still, he felt its presence, watching, waiting. His reflection in the mirror seemed slower, delayed, as if struggling to keep pace with his movements. His thoughts grew hazy, his limbs heavy, as though something unseen were pulling him away from himself. One night, he awoke to a terrible stillness. The chest was open. The doll stood at the foot of his bed. His own face stared back at him, its smile wider now, unnatural. "You are weary," it murmured, its voice his own. "Let me help." Elias could not move. His limbs were bound by some unseen force, his breath shallow. The doll climbed onto the bed, its tiny hands reaching for his face. The world darkened. When morning came, Aldrich found Elias in his workshop, working diligently, his hands moving with practiced grace. But something was different. His eyes, once sharp with ambition, were dull, empty. And beside him, seated upon the work table, the doll watched. It smiled. It had learned well.